Hey, get down. Where's the chopper? All that stuff.
Right. I am so pleased to introduce my friend Mick Wingert. Many of you may know Mick, even if you don't know Mick, but you may know Mick as the voice of Po in Kung Fu Panda, the voice of Tony Stark and Iron Man if you're watching What If on Disney Plus, Avengers Assemble, any of that stuff, and about a million other roles. He's a phenomenal voice actor, a phenomenal coach, and a real inspiration to me. So I'm really happy to have Mick just sharing his wisdom with the fellow booth junkies. Mick, thanks for coming on and chatting with us.
Hey, it is my pleasure, Mike, for sure. For those of you who don't know, Mike and I know each other from the No Sleep podcast, and we have done several stories together. I joined, I want to say, middle towards the end of season 9. Mike was well established with group there at that time.
Season 4, yeah.
And so, you came in season 4, I came in season 9, and now we're on, I think, season 18.
18.
Yeah. So
if you want to check out Mick on the No Sleep podcast, go look for, I forget what season it was. Maybe you remember, Mick, Whitefall, the season finale for whatever season that was. Whitefall,
12?
A great story. And Mick just shines. Google Whitefall on a No Sleep podcast, or if I can put a link in the description, we'll put it in there. It's great. Let's talk about animation. This is animation and whatever tips and tricks that we can pass along to some fellow booth junkies. That's not my wheelhouse. I don't do animation. I do voices for like podcasts. I've done a couple of tiny video games, but it's really not my wheelhouse. And I know that you were just putting together a webinar for industry pros, like if you've got credits, industry pros. And I saw on your socials, but there were some things there was lingo that you were talking about in that I'd never even heard of because it's not my wheelhouse. Like you were talking about prelay. What the heck is what is prelay?
It sounds much more complicated than it is. So that's a term. The webinar I'm going to be teaching for industry pros are for folks who have a lot of experience doing dubbing for anime or Japanese role-playing games, Korean role-playing games, stuff that needs to be localized for the U.S. market. And that's a specific skill set. And I found that out here in Los Angeles, there is a community of actors who are out here and fell into this kind of work. They do a lot of dubbing. They're, any number of lead roles on various anime shows that are super popular worldwide, but they came here to do what we would call cartoons or traditional animation. And the reason I am fumfering about the term cartoons is that animation in the States is so much more than kids' cartoons anymore. But they like myself came to the Los Angeles area to do that, and it kind of got this to differentiate between a dubbing gig and a gig that you got that's like a studio cartoon from Los Angeles. They came up with this term that I've heard several times. It's called prelay, and what that refers to is that when you're working in dubbing, you've got the whole visual, and your performance needs to match what's on the screen. And
right.
Prelay refers to laying down your vocal first. You lay down the vocal first, and then they animate to the vocal. Now, that's not an industry term. That's like shorthand. And the reason I used it is because that's who I'm targeting with the webinar, is to help them make that transition. Because a lot of times what I found, booth junkies might find this a bit fascinating, is that there's very little crossover between like U.S. studio animation actors and animation and dubbing, or sorry, anime and dubbing actors. So, I mean, if you were to set up a Venn diagram, the overlapping circles are only about yay deep. There's a few of us that are jumping between both. But I think a lot of the folks that are in that dubbing community would love to get into more of the studio stuff because it tends to be a union contract, much bigger, at least for a U.S. audience, it's a much bigger play. There's residuals involved. It's a much more better paying situation. Than a dubbing, which typically is, we're going to cram out as many episodes as we can in a 2-hour session, and we'll pay you for a minimum. We'll pay you a certain dollar number an hour for a minimum of 2 hours. But really, unless you book the lead of a show, that's not going to help keep the light bill on. Keep the light bill paid, I should say. So there's a lot of folks that are doing that, and having had some success in both, I think I'm going to, try to get into the practicality in that webinar of ultimately the truth of what Grandma used to say to all of us, which is dress for the job you want, and and then also like differentiating some of the skills that are required for a performance before the animation happens versus the skills that are required when the animation's already done and you're trying to match, because they're both very specific skill sets and they're incredibly different. Both of them are very difficult, but they're difficult in different ways, totally different ways.
I believe it.
Yeah, and in fact, in terms of, you were just asking like about animation, like that's I think where I would start with anybody as a voiceover coach. What really will help the modern day booth junkie who wants to get into doing voices for animation is to remember that it's all about acting. It's start throwing out the term voiceover. Don't use it anymore.
Right.
Start talking about voice acting. And that will just, it's a simple thing. And I'm not saying I don't ever say voiceover. Of course I say voiceover from time to time. I'm not militant about it, but for me, there is a very different mindset. Even when I'm doing commercial or some educational video, or if I'm auditioning for an industrial, I still consider it an acting job.
Sure. Sure.
And that's the number one thing I would start with.
Yeah. I mean, I tell people all the time, for so many of us, it really is about the acting, and we have the further challenges in many cases. Animation, maybe not as much, but you have to convey every bit of what your body's doing through only the voice.
Correct.
The voice has to really say everything about it. We don't get the benefit of waving our arms around. We might be doing that in the booth, but nobody can see it. We've got to try and convey all of that stuff.
Yeah,
which can be really challenging at times.
It really can. I think, you said that you've done a few video games, you do audio drama, that kind of thing. I think both of those are great arenas of experience, and they will lead you down the right path, whether it's you, Mike Delgadio, Grand Poobah of all things booth junkie, or an amateur audio drama player. If you can book that kind of gig, that is an audio format, and it gets in exactly what you're talking about. One of the things that I tell people when I'm coaching them is the core talent is the same. It's acting. Whether you're on stage, you're in front of a camera, or you're on a microphone, it's all acting. The core is you're pretending to be someone else in another reality. Now, that reality can be fantastic, or it can be, somebody else's mundane life in a world just like yours, but it is a different reality from yours as an actor. You're being somebody else. You're being somebody else. That's the same across the board. But there are different skills that are required for each medium. If you're on stage, your performance has to communicate to a live audience wherever they're sitting in that house. You have to move your body in a way that accommodates the structure of the stage itself. Are you a thrust stage? Are you a traditional proscenium? Are you theater in the round? You want people to be able to see you and still look natural while you're moving. If you took those skills and put them on camera, it would read like this. It's huge.
Right.
Huge.
Huge.
Because we can zoom in. We can get the most minute acting choice right here with the camera. And similarly, that microphone, like you just said, the biggest thing is you don't have any visual to help you. Even if your performance will be later tied to a visual, it has to sound like you are in the middle of whatever environment, whatever activity, whatever relationship you're in, or the audience doesn't buy it.
They don't buy it. And I think that's one of the things, like, I don't do nearly, I'm not really an acting coach. I'm more like the gearhead. But even the little bit of, acting coaching that I've done is for new people, it's getting over the hurdle of really acting, of being free when you're in the booth. So many people, I think they want to lock in front of the microphone, and they're like, oh my goodness, there's this thing in front of me, and they forget that they can gesticulate and emote and make crazy faces and really act. you must deal a lot when you're coaching new talent.
For sure.
When you're getting people to do it.
For sure. I think the biggest thing that gives a talent an edge and helps them become a successful voice actor on that trajectory towards animation is engaging that imagination. And I'm not saying you have to picture colorful pictures and, be a wild, weird Tim Burton person. When I say imagination, I just mean you have to be able to see where your character is in your brain. You have to see and be able to engage with, okay, so if I'm being chased, if my character's being chased and he's saying, "Get me out of here," then I've got to sound like I'm calling it out and like I'm running. What would that do to my body? How would my body be operating? And then how my body's operating, how would that affect the vocality? And so it's by engaging that imagination and going, oh, so I'd probably be huffing and puffing, right, as I'm, depending on what kind of shape I'm in, and I'm running, and, it's supposed to be a funny moment, so I probably want to call it out bigger because the higher the stakes, the funnier it is. So let's do something like, "Get me out of here!" Right? So it's that kind of imagination where you're putting those pieces together and allowing that to come together in your mind's eye. And if you see it, the audience will see it through your performance. But if you don't,
right? And I think just that little moment there, we could see that you're really acting and huffing and puffing. And I think that's some of what you have to get people, especially newer folks, to get into that moment, really feel like you're being chased, really feel like you're feeling that thing, because that's the only way to make it real. I mean, it's like acting 101.
Yeah.
But that's like the only way to make it feel real.
Absolutely.
You got to really do it. You got to believe it.
Absolutely. For a little crossover, because I know your channel is a gear channel and you're a self-professed gearhead, as we just heard you say, there's a little bit of crossover here, and this goes back to my experience of voice acting classes from when I first started taking classes. People are so, at least the old school thought is, you have to be super intentional to tell the students not to touch the equipment because the mic doesn't have a discernment button. You can't tell it to hear some stuff but not everything, right? There's no way to get it just to record your voice. So if you make noise or you touch the instrument or you knock the copy stand if you're being too physical, you got to be careful. And I think the default was always, okay, everybody, let's put your hands in a hang 10. This is your appropriate stance. Every time you get in the booth, do this to the microphone. Now, if you did that in a real session, like especially if it's a group session, everybody'd be like, oh, I guess it's his first time in the booth. They've never done this before. But this is what everybody's taught. Do your hang 10 to the diaphragm of your mic. And then they also are commanded. I remember taking my first animation class in Los Angeles by an elderly woman who's no longer with us now, but her name was Dolores Deal, and she was a very old-timey Hollywood, like so old school. And she told us, you want your arms bent at about anywhere between 90 and a 45 degree angle, and you want them pinned at your sides. Pinned your elbows at your sides. And so you got a lot of people that were acting like this and, trying to emote. And the truth is, that keeps you from touching the gear. It keeps you from hitting the copy stand. But you can't act like this unless you're playing somebody bound and gagged, which does happen in a sleep podcast. But the opposite of that is true. I remember being on Kung Fu Panda Legends of Awesomeness and getting to work in group sessions with incredible voice actors. One of whom is still a friend of mine to this day, Fred Tatasciore, who's got a ton of credits, way more than I do. And Fred, even when he wasn't, miming whatever action his character was doing with his hands, he would still use his hands in every take. They'd be off to the side so they wouldn't hit anything. Nobody could hear his hands, but he would conduct his performances like, he'd say, "I said, let's go to the river," and he'd use his hands to make that happen. And that stuck with me. So when I have to do efforts and whatnot, I will, I gotta rein it in so I don't hit the microphone or anything. But I do throw punches. Sometimes I'll throw kicks, just as long as I'm not making foot noise, right? We can't hear your shoe hit the ground. But if you can be physical, it only makes your performance sing.
Absolutely. And that's not just for animation. I mean, I use that like in e-learning. I'll use that kind of, if there's something that I need to hit, I definitely have my own, gesticulations. If I find myself getting sing-songy, I'll make hand motions, but like even yourself out, Mike, or if I need to hit things. And I've seen any number of voice actors, even if they're doing just like little ad copy, well, they'll do this and they make sure they hit the hero or whatever it is, and that they've got that. Like you said, it's like conducting themselves.
That physicality makes such a big difference. I mean, at one point or another, everything becomes a parlor trick to, get you to perform the way that you need to perform. And I think all of us aspire to be at that place where, this is such a rote skill for us and such a rote talent for us that we don't need the parlor tricks. But that shouldn't keep anyone from using them if they work. If a guy that has 400 million credits like Fred Tatasciore can be conducting himself in the booth while he's talking, and he's a pro, then do whatever you've got to do to make that performance come to life.
I mean, I think for some people, I don't know how it is for him, but for me, it's sometimes just getting myself into that headspace of this is what I want to do. It helps me not fall into maybe some bad habits, like bad habits that my coaches like tried to get me out of. Sometimes it just helps you, like, this is the mindset I'm in. Like, you see drummers or guitar players that will do their warm-ups just to get into the headspace of doing the right performance. Yeah. So so I want to sidebar for 1 second. So you just sort of throw out there, I'm Po for Kung Fu Panda. I mean, that's a huge iconic role. Are you intentionally a voice match for Jack Black? You sound so much like him when you're Po. For me, it's indistinguishable. Are you intentionally voice matching him? Is it coincidental?
It's a little bit of both. And I've told this story on other interviews, so I'll give you the short version just so that your listeners, in case they haven't seen me before, can still understand. But I won't take too much time with it. I didn't know I had a Jack Black voice match, and there was another guy in the industry who was auditioning for the Activision video game that was going to be released alongside the first Kung Fu Panda feature. Jack, as you know, was cast as Po in that, and he was doing voice match, but he didn't have Jack in his repertoire, just different. He sits in a different area of the orchestra than Jack does, and this friend of mine sent the casting director my way on a blind recommendation, saying, "This is the guy you want. Call Mick Wingert's agent." And I had never, ever done Jack Black before in my life.
Wow.
But we have a similar presence in our vocal vocal instruments. So we sit in the same section of the orchestra. I like to consider us the brass section.
Right.
Nice. Whereas, he might be a trombone and I'm more of a French horn or more of a, some other, but we're in that same brass section, right? And James Arnold Taylor, who is the actor that referred me, he might be more of a wind instrument, or, you can take the metaphor as far as you want. But But knowing that I sat in the same section of the orchestra, that I already sounded like Jack, he was confident that I could nail the audition. And I pulled my hair out all weekend long over a weekend just trying to get what makes Jack's voice different than mine, so I knew what I was doing. And that actually was harder than doing some big impression. So, I think there's a difference between doing impressions and doing a voice match.
Right.
Like, I think anybody can get the handholds on climbing the mountain that is Arnold Schwarzenegger's voice, right? If you grab onto that Austrian accent and you grab onto, kind of the roundness of the vowels and the real weird guttural efforts, and effort noises he does. Everybody can do one of these, like that. Get down. Where's the chopper? All that stuff.
Right.
So if you get the accent, you get the tones, you get the efforts. Those are huge handholds. Anybody can grab that, and it's really fun at parties. But voice matching is literally trying to be, as you said, indistinguishable from another person's voice. And that, in my experience, best happens when you sit in the same section of the orchestra, the metaphorical orchestra. But also you have to key in, at least I did, like what makes our voices different. If I can figure out what makes them different, and then I can try to emulate the way he speaks versus the way I speak. So I didn't try to do a whole lot with pitch. I do now because he's been a lot harder on his throat than I have. So like he talks like way down here now because he's smoked a lot of ganja and he's smoked a lot of other things and he's sung a lot in rock and roll. So it's just
for sure.
So he's kind of down here like this now. But really, it's the way that he forms his words is a lot flatter, and what I would call, this is not industry term, this is a Mick Wingertism, I would call it more lateral. Like his pronunciation and his articulation of the words is more lateral until he's doing a bit for comedy. So he might sound like total slacker and everything's kind of mumbled like this, and it's very lateral. He's got very flat vowels like that. Everything looks kind of default sounds like it's got a sarcastic smile, unless he goes up here like this and starts to like when he does that bit. Now we're getting very staccato and we're getting very punchy and we're getting very, very over articulate for the sake of the comedy. But again, that's a bit that he does with his voice. That's not his default speaking. And I speak like I came from the Central Valley of California because I did, and he came from like West LA because he does, and it just this is kind of his different sound for me. So I learned how to put that on, and that made all the difference. Was for me was figuring out, okay, where does that voice differ from mine, and how do I put on that difference? For Robert Downey Jr., I don't have a lot of voice matches, but the ones I have, I feel like I'm really confident about. For Robert, I noticed that he's kind of got a nasal placement up here like that.
Right.
And his voice is also kind of sets down here, especially as he's gotten older. And the biggest thing is he does, like, the top lip doesn't move a whole lot. But even when it does, he will do something with his articulation where he says a few things and then pauses and really quickly says the rest of the line. Right? And that became, so if I gave it that kind of like placement, if I shot my voice into like my hard palate and kind of started talking up here towards my nose and my nasal cavities, and I just kind of chewed my cheek a little bit. I mean, this is also kind of the same starting place as a Nick Cage, and it's also kind of the same starting place as a Paul Giamatti. My friend Eric Bauza, who does a lot of voice match, he says, "Yeah, when I do Giamatti, I just try to chew my cheek. If I chew the inside of my cheek, it sounds like Giamatti." I'm like, that's not bad. That's not bad.
I am fangirling so hard right now. This is so much fun.
So it really is learning to work with the instrument that you've got. I would recommend, and I didn't study this formally, but I did go to college and I picked up some things in theater classes that helped me understand how human language is formed, right? Whether it's the International Phonetic Alphabet or just learning what the different phonemes, or that's the sound articles of speech, are. Take a YouTube class on, while you're doing your Booth Junkie classes, right after that video, go to the speech pathology tutorials.
Yeah.
Seriously. Yeah. Because the more you understand about how we form language, the more tools that are at your disposal to change the way you speak language.
I know from like the No Sleep podcast, we never interact.
Yeah, unfortunately.
For to most of your animation work, is it like I've always heard like the interviews with the guys from Archer, the guys and gals from Archer. They're like, yeah, we never see each other. We do all of our sides at once and hope that they match up with somebody else. Is that the way it is for you mostly? For the TV gigs?
It depends on the show.
You just record all of your
Yeah,
sides?
it depends on the show. Like the way it used to be done for animation, I would say up until the 80s, even into the 90s and the early 2000s, is most of the time, especially for kids animation, everybody would be in the same room and you'd have a cast of 5 to 6 people, and amongst that cast, you'd get the majority or bulk of the show recorded. And then if you had a day player who couldn't make it that day, they would come in and record on their own and work with the director, and the director would read opposite them, and they'd get the performance that could, just cut and layer in. Now, post-COVID, especially now that so much has went to remote for so long, we were the only people in Hollywood that were working, were the voice actors, because we could do it remotely. Right. So the animation studios all kind of went, huh? There's this thing called remote recording that you can do, which if you've worked in promo, trailer, even educational video or industrial video at any level out in the Midwest, out in the East Coast, you've had either a ISDN line or Source Connect or some kind of digital remote interface for years. But Hollywood's like, Source Connect? What's that? Right? 10 years later, after Source Connect hits 10 years later, they're like, we could record this remotely and not have people in the studio? Are you serious? Yes, Karen. You can.
A couple of days ago, I interviewed the co-founder of,
of
Source Elements, Rebecca. She's amazing, and she's like, the past few years were pretty insane.
I can imagine.
I think it was just unbelievable. I'm sure what they went through.
And it seems like in terms of the big Hollywood studios, and maybe because they're entrenched and there's just a way of doing things that has been established over decades, it seems like they're about a decade behind any curve in terms of technology. Like, again, I took voiceover classes like in 2004. So we're talking about 18 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And everybody was telling me, you have to have an ISDN line. You have to have an ISDN, a separate line. It was, you have 2 phone numbers. You got to pay every month. Plus you got to pay your couple $100 to get it installed. If you don't have that, you can't record remotely. Meanwhile, my friends who were working in promo in 2004 were like, there's this wonderful thing called Source Connect that just hit. Yeah. And it's all digital. We all have cable Wi-Fi now, or cable internet. So they use that broadband, and so all the industry standards for big studio stuff has always been behind. Anyway, to get back to your actual question, I've done remote recordings in a group with a service like Riverside, or which I do for my podcast, the Hidden Frequencies. And I've done one where it's a bunch of us on Zoom and Source Connect in multiple channels on Source Connect for Nickelodeon when we were recording an episode of Big Nate, and that showrunner definitely likes the synergy of having everybody in one room and letting the guys play off of each other, because it's a kids comedy show. It's basically a real snappy sitcom set in middle school, and the snappier, better energy, the better the performance, the better the animation's going to be. So you'll get that as a value system, and it still even happens post-COVID. And then you'll get, I would say, these days, the majority of things, and anything adult comedy like Archer, like Bob's Burgers, like even The Simpsons, I think probably records individually. Though I will say The Simpsons always does what's called a table read, and that's where everybody gets together on a Friday night and the whole cast is there, including guest players, as often as they can get them, and reads through the whole script as like a table reading of a radio play or something. They just go through the whole thing, work the jokes, and preview the script. But is Dan Castellaneta in the booth with Julie Kavner anymore? Probably not. Probably not. Most of it is individual at this point.
Yeah. So let's dig into the Hidden Frequencies a little bit, because I think that podcast, I think you operate it a little bit differently than the way David does for No Sleep. No Sleep, we just get our script, and many times it would be up to us individually if we wanted to collaborate on something. But most of the time we're putting out multiple takes of that line, and we're sending it off, and sometimes we don't hear it until it's released. But I think you, if I recall correctly, you direct your talent either in ensemble or individually when you're creating your episodes, but you're the director.
I am.
Right?
So yeah, I direct mostly because I'm a control freak here on Hidden Frequencies, but also when I first started Hidden Frequencies, not only was it a passion project, but it was a means to an end. Like, I wanted practical experience directing in group read sessions because the best sessions I'd had were all in groups. The best performances I gave, as well as I was a part of, were all group sessions in animation. Like Kung Fu Panda Legends of Awesomeness used to be group. Marvel Avengers Assembles used to be a group read. And that was like a dozen people in a studio, like a U-shaped ring or semi-ring of copy stands and microphones, right? And the engineers like literally doing this on the other side of the glass, bringing people's volume up for their line, pulling it down and bringing up the next guy for their line, and like jumping back and forth. It was real skill. And I really wanted to voice direct, and I loved doing it in groups. And I knew that if I was going to ask for favors from my pro voice actor friends to be on the show, I would at least have to make it fun. And there's nothing more fun than doing what you love with other people. So that was one of the reasons that I chose to direct it. I also think you get a better performance. I mean, having worked on the No Sleep podcast and heard the finished product over the last several years, I mean, I think it's incredible, the synergy that David's able to build with all remote recording. But I think it's the exception, not the rule. I wouldn't.
I think you're probably right.
I think it's that David is surrounded himself by really talented people who know what they're doing and know what they have to communicate in both narrative as well as character performances on the show. And I mean, we can see both as cast members as well as just audience members can see that there's been a culling process over the years. Some people have stuck around for years at a time. Some people have come and gone. Some people, were made for this kind of thing, and some people weren't. And I think David's been super lucky and also really intentional about finding the core of people who like to do this and are good at it.
Yeah.
But I could trust my actors to remote record for sure, because I'm working with a lot of my pros that are friends of mine. But I think they would appreciate the direction as well. They want to know that they're not alone in creating this, because when we are working professionally, you're always working with a director of some kind. And so that's why I've opted to direct. Again, I feel like I get good performances out of everybody, and it also helps me see the product through so that the story is really consistent. And again, I have to hand it to David. The crew he's pulled together, he gets a really remarkably consistent product. So casting no shade on remote recording, but it is the exception in my experience, not the rule.
Yeah. The effort he puts through, we collectively put together an episode of that size and that quality every week. They move mountains. They move absolute mountains.
100%. 100%.
I mean, I know I did a 2-episode. My wife and I, we wanted that similar practice as we weren't nearly as ambitious as Hidden Frequencies. We made 2 episodes. We wanted to make a movie, a 2-part movie, and it took months of effort. Months of effort. We were pretty green at it, but I see what you've put together with Hidden Frequencies, because they're big episodes. They're really well produced. The bar is high, and they're not easy to put together. Audio dramas are not easy.
They're not. Put together. I said earlier it was a passion project. Like, I love old radio theater, and I'm sure by the 50s, when it was it's the waning part of its golden age of radio theater, like they had gotten their systems down and everything went like this, and they had live Foley guys there doing sound effects, and somebody was on the organ in the studio going dun, 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 for all the transitions. Like, I'm sure they had this flow and it was easy by the time they were done with it, but like recreating that in 2022, even with the technology that we have, like you said, it is laborious because you got to record, you got to edit. We always recorded like it was an animation session, so we do a pass of a scene. We wouldn't do the whole play at one at a time, or like the whole script. We would do a scene, and then we would do a second, do it again, and then I'd go back for pickups. So we'd have all that audio from one scene that I'd have to go through, pull my selects, and then we'd go to the next scene, pull the selects, so on and so forth. And
what's a select?
Good question. For the Booth Junkies at home, selects is a shorthand jargon phrase that means of all the audios, let's say I do 3 takes of a line over 2 passes of the scene plus, some random pickups. Pickups, by the way, are I didn't get exactly what I needed in pass 1. I gave you some direction and you applied it in pass 2, but I still didn't get it the way it sounds to my ear. So on take 3, it's just going to be your line. We're just going to get Mike's line, and Mike, I want you to give me 3 in a row. We're going to have you do, your line is, "Where's the store?" And I'm going to get it 3 times in a row, and I'm going to try to massage it and or direct it till I get it the way it needs to read in the story, for the story. Those are pickups. From those pickups, plus the 2 full passes of the scene, you have, I don't know, that's 3, 4, 5 versions of that line that are recorded. A select is the one that you want to use for the final recording. So for every line that you hear in an animated show, I won't even speak to audio dramas because everybody's got a different process for that. But what I will say is for animation, every line you hear, there's at least 2 to 3, if not a dozen versions of that same line that went into the ether and never got to production. They might be sitting on a hard drive somewhere as backup. They might have gone into the ether and gotten erased, depending on what the studio's procedure was for it. Only the selects go to production, and that it's the piecing together of the selects, even in a group read, that make the show come together, make the dialogue of the show come together. Did that explain it?
I always called them the buys.
The buys.
We always called them the buys because those are ones that you were paying
for. Coming from the commercial world, are we?
So you can do audio production. So this is for people, if you're interested in creating your own audio drama, you and your friends want to get together. You want to practice. You want to work out scenes. You want to do stuff. You can do something like Riverside. You could do something. My experience with Zoom is harder because Zoom seems to be slower. There's a latency between people, and it's really hard to get timing for comedy for those sorts of things. I found Zoom to be harder. Have you found Riverside to be
absolutely
workable?
And no I'm not not sponsored. Like I'm not getting a dime from Riverside, but I do use it because it gives me real-time recording with minimal latency. What's great about it is that you get 4 separate tracks. My biggest problem with Zoom is I have to take the Zoom master audio with all its glitches and dropouts and everything else in one single blend of everybody's performance if I'm recording on Zoom. And what that usually means is I have to have my actors recording in the background so that they can then upload their WAV files to like a Dropbox or some cloud service so that then I can pull them in and edit. But with Riverside, it already does that step for them. It uses, whatever your inputs are, your microphone, your camera, and it records to the cloud and then finishes uploading. And once it's finished uploading, you've got that pretty high quality audio. And I really like because it saves that step of. Also, it keeps the actors from having to engineer themselves. They don't have to worry about, is my gain too high? And did you get that? And that didn't drop out, did it? Like, just don't worry about it. The less an actor has to do, they're actors. Come on. The less an actor has to do, the better. I'm an actor.
And for those playing along at right. And for those playing along at home, I do use Riverside. I'm not sponsored. I'm a paying customer. I made some Riverside videos way in the beginning when they were launching. They asked me to make some videos. I'm not sponsored by them. I pay my way. I do too for Riverside.
So gear wise, I try to be as practical as possible. If you can get studio sound with a a blue Snowball or a blue Yeti underneath a really heavy blanket, as long as that blanket doesn't rub that microphone and it sounds like it's in a studio, that's all you need. I'm not one of the things I love about Booth Junkie is I'm not, a Top Gear guy. Now, I know there are a lot of gearheads out there and they want to know various things. I noticed when I started going in studios both for narrative gigs as well as animation gigs, I was oftentimes being put on a Sennheiser 416. So with that in mind, when it was time for me to buy my big boy mic, I bought a Sennheiser 416 and I've never looked back. I'm thinking about at this point getting a Neumann, but I haven't yet because they're so expensive, and really it's just that's just a prestige item. That's something you show off. But B, also one of the things I don't like about those large diaphragm mics like the Neumanns and their ilk, the AKGs, those kind of things, is that these microphones, I just call them relentless. Just as I said, there's no discernment button on the mic. You can't tell it to hear some stuff and not others. That large diaphragm microphone is the most relentless. It will catch every mouth click, every movement of your shirt. I mean, it is a high performance instrument. And I feel like there's a little bit of forgiveness with, not much, but there's a little bit with this unidirectional shotgun that I'm using, shotgun microphone, and that's why I went with that instead. Some studios do prefer that you're on a big, large diaphragm mic, either a Neumann instrument or something that approximates to a high quality degree that Neumann sound. But for my money, I have yet to have a reason to switch away from this 416. It's great.
It's hard to go wrong. The 416 has a reputation for being like the promo mic because it gives you this big voice, but it is a very forgiving. It's a great mic. It's a great mic. I've made a lot of money with my 416, and I really like. I mean, I've often said, like, if I only had to have one, if I could only have one, I would let my U87 go and I would keep my 416.
What I will say too is I do get a lot of people, because I am in the teaching business, asking me gear questions, and when I'm not sending them to Booth Junkie and I'm just trying to give them a short answer to a long question, I'm the first guy, like I said at the beginning of all this, be as practical as you can. And I'm a huge believer in the Audio-Technica AT 2020. That mic is such a great mic for $99. And that the $99 version is the XLR version that you then plug into a preamp. But they also have the $149 version, so it's $50 more for a USB. And both of those versions of that microphone are just clear. I still have mine. That was my first real microphone, and I still have it, and I will use it from time to time. Not for production anymore, but when I'm setting up a 2-microphone system, that's my other mic, because it's still great. You get a really crisp sound.
Punches above its weight for $99.
Oh my gosh, yeah. You're talking price to performance all day long on that one. Blue has some good technology, as I've already mentioned. I think they helped kind of renew and then set a new bar for USB, but you'd know better than I would. You're the tech guy. But I just remember, like, when the Snowball first dropped, it made waves, and then when the Yeti dropped, it made waves, and became a go-to instrument for a lot of people. So,
what's your preferred cans?
Right now I'm running comfort-wise. I'm running Sennheisers. I don't
got my Sennies on. Do you have a particular model?
I have the HD 569s.
569s, excellent.
Yeah,
good choice. I'm wearing the long discontinued, my favorite. I just replaced the pads on these. These are my HD 380 Pros, because they're just like, oh my god, they're so comfortable. So comfortable. When I'm recording, comfort before
100%.
There are many out there. I'm not dissing it. I've got many headphones that I really like, but the HD 380 Pros.
Yeah, the ones I see in studio a lot are the AKG headphones that have the stiff wire top. And you can get those in various different forms of comfort, from a leather pad to a soft pad to everything in between. I see a lot of the are they Sonys? I see a lot of Sonys, and I see a lot of
7506s.
Audio-Technicas. And I have a set of Audio-Technicas as well. See a lot of those.
Yeah, I've been in studios, lots of studios with the M50
Yes,
varieties,
yes.
M50Xs. Those the HD 280 Pros. I've been in a number of studios with the real cheap the Sennheiser HD 280 Pros, which are like maybe $100. They're also really good if they fit your ears. They sound great too. They sound great. I just like to know what people are rocking because I've never worn those.
I like them.
So
I ordered them. My son is a gearhead, and for a while he fancied him. Well, he's been a video gamer for a long time. Now, when you're playing video games, you tend to like to have an open back headphone because you want to be able to hear your ambient sound in your home in case the SWAT team's at your door. As well as your in-game audio in real 5.1 stereo. So I asked him, well, what are the hardback versions? Because in studio you can't have noise bleed, as you well know. I asked him what the hardback versions were, and this is what came up. And I was like, sounds good to me. They've been comfy. I like them a lot. They rest well.
Yeah. The new Rodes, if you're for anybody else, the new Rode, the NTH 100s, they have pretty generous ear cups. My ears fit in those.
I was also going to say for anybody who wants that 416 Sennheiser 416 sound, or at least a close approximation, but is budget conscious and can't pay the $700 to $1,000 for the microphone, which I understand. The Rode NTG2 is a shotgun microphone that was my studio mic until I got this one, and I recorded stuff that went to production on it and has a great fidelity of sound. And those Aussies, they're kicking our asses when it comes to audio equipment.
The folks at Rode, they
hashtag not sponsored.
Not sponsored. They've given me a bunch of free stuff. Full disclosure, they've given me a ton of free stuff along the ways, but their products super reliable. They've always been worked. And if they match your sound, if you like the way they sound, like I've made no bones about the fact that like there's some Rode mics that I sound great on, some that I don't like the way I sound on. So, but yeah, that's my son uses the NTG2 for his streaming
great
stuff. So
I loved it. I loved having it. In fact, I had a student who was in one of my ongoing groups. As soon as I swapped it out, she was like, "What are you doing with your Rode? Because I'll buy it from you." I was like, okay. And I think that's the last thing that I want to say about tech and gear for the audience is when you start developing your ear, the more you're a booth junkie, the more you're going to start listening for differences in audio, and you'll develop your ear, and you'll understand when you sound good and when you sound boxy. You'll understand what instrument makes you sound like $1 million, and it may not be that high-end $5,000 tube microphone. It might be that
no question
$100 AT2020, and if that's the case, don't be proud, or don't be too proud to use it. I mean, just go for the one that makes you sound great, like $1 million, because everybody's instrument is different.
That is absolutely. Have you learned things as a director, directing other people, being directed a lot by a director, for people who have never had a director or becoming first-time directors? Like what do we pass along?
Gosh,
to them?
This is a whole podcast in and of itself. Seriously, like we could
do another hour.
I don't have the time because I got to teach tonight. But yes, we could fill another hour. Maybe I'll come back and we'll talk more about this. But the short answer is there's a couple of different things I would jump out with. Number one of the things that I think the number one thing I want to say is don't direct and act at the same time. Try to create the mental space to do one or the other, so that when you're on mic and you're trying to be in the moment, creating the reality, I am this person in that reality, sci-fi or otherwise, like I'm being this person. The moment you step out of that moment to go, am I doing this moment correctly? You've stopped being in the moment. You've stepped out of it to analyze it. You can't be analytical and creative at the same time. You can get really, really good and really fast at going from analytical to creative and back and forth. But no brain is physiologically capable of doing both at the same time. And the biggest mistake that people make, whether it's they're auditioning for something on, one of the pay-to-play sites or from voice actors casting club, or they have already been cast in something and they're trying to get that right take to make the story come alive. The biggest mistake is not realizing that you've stopped acting because you're now directing yourself in the booth. So one of the things that I tell people practically is get in there and perform. Go make believe. Go make believe through the whole script or through the whole scene. Once you've got that laid down, come out of the booth, and this takes longer. I know this. I know it takes longer. But it's a practical way to help set boundaries with yourself. Don't direct it until you've listened back. When you listen back, that's when you direct. Oh, I buy that line. Oh, I don't buy that line. How should I change that line so I would buy it better? And then do your pickups.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to do it in the moment, on the fly, on the microphone, especially at the hobbyist or amateur level, you're just not facile enough to both direct and act. And you're going to end up directing, and that's what we'll hear. That's what the audience will hear. Wow, he's really directing himself in there. And that tells us you're not the character. You're not in the moment. It's not really happening. You've got a script. And that's the last thing you want.
Yeah. Context switching has a price. To switch mentally between being the part, being the engineer, being the director, it has a cost to it. And that cost is often the performance. So what a fantastic piece of advice, and an excellent place to leave it. And yeah, I'm sure we will have you back to talk about directing, because we love it. I am so inspired by you. I love your work. I love listening to you. I love watching your work. You've been so inspirational to me, and I'm really grateful that you've spent an hour sharing all of these nuggets of wisdom. It's great. It's great. Thanks so much, Mick.
The pleasure's mine.
Pleasure. And I'll put all your socials down in there, and I'll link to anything that you want me to link to down in the
Sounds
basement.
good.
But man,
thank you. It's such an honor to be here with you, and keep booth junkieing, man. You're doing God's work out there. All right, everybody. Thank you.